Mike Roy, brother, how are you, man?
Not bad. How you doing?
I'm well. It's good to see you again. It's been a couple years.
Yeah, you too.
Yeah, man. So, without further ado, let's jump into it. And one of the things I wanted to ask you is you had an opportunity with where you fish, which is, I'll let you talk about that, in fact, but the diversity of habitats that you deal with and the ability that you've had in the winter times to fish several different locations. Let's say, hypothetically, I were to drop you, blindfold you on the trip there, drop you in some inshore saltwater environment. Let's call it
Mhm.
let's call it an estuary system. What would you, and you knew nothing about it, what would you want your vessel to be rigged up like? What would you take for your gear? And how would you go about figuring it out if you knew nothing about it?
Yeah, that's definitely challenging. So I'll just say, I'm in Vero Beach, Florida, right now, and it's a challenge going to a new area, especially going from northern inshore fishermen to southern inshore because the bait is different. How you hook the bait, how you rig the bait, the water temperature, the environmental factor, completely different species. So you find your similarities, but you're also learning a lot of new stuff too. But so to answer your question, it's going to be it would be a challenge for sure. But um, first of all, I definitely would want my electronics are huge for me, so the side imaging is going to be key to locating bait and then locating the game fish. I would say locate bait, then and you locate fish as a result of that. Generally speaking, most areas, if you find the bait, you can find the fish. Um, so electronics are huge. Second to that would just be visual cues. So hopefully, if there's obvious visual cues, you're going to see birds, bait, um, structure. There may be visible structure. So you're going to see a trough on the beach, a rip line, um, current. You'd want a tide and current chart for sure. Um, but and then as far as the bottom structure goes, that's where the side imaging and the sonar units come into play. Also, a good chart system uh, is really important, and being able to have those contour lines, and also look if you could do some homework ahead of time. Um, if you have like relief shading and being able to highlight the bottom structure, that's going to be important as well. A lot of you said an estuary system, so
Yeah,
I
let's call
think
it an
a lot
estuary
of
system. Yeah.
yeah, I think a lot of good areas are going to be where you have shallow water within close proximity to deep water.
Right.
So a lot of game fish will hang in, say, there's a channel and there's a flat. They're going to go on the flat maybe to feed, but they could quickly transition into deeper water as well.
Yeah. And so from there you're drawing your map, and what are you looking for as you kind of map out your areas? Like, if you went to look at your chart and you designed things and drew things up and you began to paint the picture of what you're dealing with, other than, adjacency to deep water, are there other specific things you're looking for, like changes in bottom type or like choke
Mm-hmm.
points, things like that?
Yeah, transitions usually are really good. So you'll see this a lot. It again, I'm going to talk a lot about side imaging because I utilize it. It's a big part
Yeah.
of how I fish, and traditional sonar and the mapping maps. But um, you'll see transitions where it goes from boulders to sand, and a lot of times we'll mark fish on that transition line. Another thing to mention is water temperature as well, and that's everywhere I fish. Water temperature plays a pretty big role. Um, the current will impact water temperature. So you may have a large body of water that floods into and out of the estuary. That large body of water will impact the water temperature of the estuary. So on the flood or incoming tide, that large body of water will, if you're in a lot of scenarios, it'll be warmer, but also could be it could be the opposite too. So I'm here in Florida right now. The right now the water temperature out front is warmer than the water inside the estuary. And as that incoming tide comes in, all in the mouth of that estuary, now you have that 72, 73-degree water coming in versus the 68-degree water. Um, but we see that up north where you'll have in the spring, the river water warms up first. That's warmer. Uh, that water on an outgoing tide, you have all that warm water in the mouth of the river, and then the flood tide, as it starts to come in, all that cool ocean water starts flooding in. And I've seen those fish move with that tide line upriver. But then in the summer, it's the opposite effect where that estuary water jacks way up because it's shallower. So basically, the I guess the bottom line is shallow water has more temperature variant and it fluctuates quicker. Even you get a couple cold nights and it could drop 5-6 degrees. The large body, the ocean water, or the that adjacent, whatever is if it floods into a larger bay or the ocean, that water is going to stay more consistent generally.
Yeah. And that must be a huge consideration. Like you fish out of the Connecticut primarily, right?
Yep. Primarily Old Sabre, Connecticut. That's where I live, and that's where I'm based out of. So we're primarily fishing Connecticut River and Long Island Sound. Connecticut River is the largest river in New England. It's 420 miles long. So you got a massive amount of bait and fish coming in and out of that river. You also have a lot of environmental impact because if it floods that river, all the sediment from the whole stretch of river and all the tributaries, that all comes down into the river, so that water could get real dirty, and then that dumps out into the Long Island Sound, which is
Yeah.
also a massive. I mean, Long Island Sound, if you think about it, it's a massive estuary. What's interesting about the Sound, it's 110 miles east to west. At the widest point, which is in the western part of the Sound, closer to New York, it's 16 miles across. Where I fish in Old Saybrook, which I guess would be central, actually technically it's more to the eastern Long Island Sound, but that because Long Island forks, there's a North Fork and a South Fork. The North Fork's directly across from Old Saybrook. It's only 8 miles across. So what you get, if you think about it, it's a choking point where to the west it's 16 miles, it chokes to 8, and that's why we have such big current velocity where we're using a lot of times if you're fishing out in the Sound and you want to stay vertical with your bait, we're using 12 ounce, 14, even 16-ounce sinkers. You have currents on a mood tide in the entrance of Long Island Sound area called the Race and Plum Gut, where you'll have currents like on an ebb or outgoing current, it'll be 5 knots. So you have, yeah, because you're going from a wide spot to a narrow spot, and all that water increases velocity and really rushes out.
Yeah. Is there a big depth change in there too?
There is, yeah. The deepest part is it's over 300 feet, and
Whew.
there's a pretty well known area called Valiant Shoal,
Okay.
and that comes up to like 25 feet, 30 feet. So
Huge.
you have a big current velocity, and then you have a shelf. So you can imagine that the rip line there could be pretty outstanding. It just could be massive, especially if you had a situation where you had like an outgoing an ebb current, which would flow west to east. And then if you had a wind that was out of the east and the current and wind are opposing each other, it's like hitting a wall of water. It could be pretty gnarly there.
It seems like it. And I'm
Yeah.
assuming the bait stacks up in there pretty well too. Just there's so
Yeah,
much water exchange happening.
exactly. Yeah, that area seems to consistently hold bait for most of the year. There's some kind of bait in there. Um, yeah, always something.
Is there like a seasonality to it? Like early you'll see more squid or something like that, and later more anchovies, etc.
Yeah. I mean, throughout I don't want to talk about the race specifically. I wouldn't say
Okay.
I'm an expert on the race. I mean, it's not my primary fishing area, but
Right.
um, just in the Long Island Sound in general, you do get so usually around late May and early June, we get the big push of Menhaden or bunker, we call them. They push in. We also have the river herring. So we have river herring and alewives. They move up the river to spawn, and usually that occurs April and May. So that's a springtime thing. Um, Usually those herring drop out around June, and then later in the summer is when you get the juvenile squid, juvenile butterfish. You'll get sand eels, and then as you transition into fall, which is late August into September, that's when you get all the small bait. So you have a plethora of small bait with bay anchovies, silver sides, sand eels, butterfish, and that's what creates that. What people refer to as like the fall run, like all the top water feeds with the you have the terns working and the bluefish and stripers and bonita and albies all working them on the surface.
Yeah. And so when you mentioned the herring run, I'm assuming the returns of the river herring, the alewives in the Connecticut River, must be one of the largest returns on the entire seaboard. I mean, you must deal with a significant amount of those baits, and the fish must get fairly keyed in on them early season, huh?
Yeah, yep. But that a lot of that occurs way upriver too, because
Right.
those herring and alewives they go way up. I mean, and guys catch stripers um, in that particular river, the Connecticut River. It's a 90 miles from the mouth in Old Saybrook to the Holyoke Dam,
Right.
and a lot of those herring and alewives are going way upriver, and they'll go up the little tributaries. There's also a lot of smaller rivers um, throughout Long Island Sound that have big herring runs as well. So there was definitely a lot going in and out of that river, and it also converges with the time when the bunkers start to show up too. So you
Right.
kind of get by like June, by early June, you have the alewives and river herring starting to drop out from their spawn, and then you have the bunker showing up as well. So you have a good healthy bait source.
And will that, generally speaking, draw in your first push of truly big fish in that kind of early June timeframe, late May?
It's yeah, it seems like it at least a trend the past 5 years or so. Seems like the we get the schoolies show up in early May, and then followed by these big gator bluefish, usually mid May, which is a lot of fun. Then I don't know where they go. It's like the blues show up and then take off. Same with the schoolies, and from the tagging I've done with the schoolies, a lot of those schoolies drop out by like Memorial Day, and then they're all heading up. So we're getting tags recaptured in Massachusetts, Cape Cod, New Hampshire, Maine, all the way up to almost Canada.
Yep.
Um, yeah,
That makes sense. I mean, me north of Boston, I'm probably seeing those same fish that have left the Connecticut. We get 2 or 3 pushes of school size fish
yeah,
throughout the early spring. The first run, I always say May 12th. You can set your watch to it is when I'm catching my first fish in the rivers,
yeah,
the micros,
yeah.
But that second or third push we'll usually get right around Memorial Day, maybe first week of June. We're getting an additional push of fish, and
Yep.
I figure they must be coming from you.
Do you guys have a winter holdover population up there?
Allegedly. North of Boston, I'm not familiar with one. I do know that there are holdovers in Boston. The
Yeah.
Charles and the Mystic do have holdovers.
Okay.
And then I know on the Cape there are some that will hold over. But as far as I understand it, the rivers that dump into Boston are our major holdover fisheries.
Gotcha. Okay. All right.
I
We
don't think many people are going out there and looking for them either. It wouldn't
could be
surprise me if
that.
there were a
Yeah.
lot in the Merrimack.
Right. Right. Is that where you fish out of, Merrimack?
No, I fish on the south side of Cape Ann is where I've been out of. So if you look at
Okay.
a chart of Massachusetts, you got the big indent of Boston, and
Yep.
then north of there, there's a smaller cape that sticks out north of that.
Right.
I'm on the south side of that smaller cape, and
Gotcha.
we are all granite rock. We have beaches, but our beaches are like 300 yards long. And
Oh
then
wow.
once you get up north of Cape Ann, it's all sand. I mean, all the way up into Maine and
Okay.
estuaries. So my buddies are out of the Merrimack,
Yep.
which is it's the biggest river in Massachusetts.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's similar. It's very similar to the Connecticut River. I mean, it's got the anadromous kind of shad species, the herring species, and it's got sturgeon in it. And the fish will get in there early season, and then it's actually very similar to how I would assume you're doing most of your program. The way that those guys fish, they're targeting a lot of earlier in the year they'll be up inside structure fishing. Their bigger fish will be usually inside the mouth structure fishing. As the season wanes on, they've got bunker on the front. and they're kind of beachfront fishing, moving with the bait schools, that sort of thing
Yeah.
as the season
Yeah.
moves on. Yeah.
Yeah.
Got to be pretty
And
similar.
yeah, we do have a big winter holdover population here in Connecticut, but also the Hudson River, which isn't that far from us. I mean, those fish. We have a lot of fish that transition in and out of the Hudson River that end up in Long Island Sound and up into our river systems. But all the rivers in Connecticut have holdover populations. Some are more known than others, particularly the western part of Connecticut, like the Housatonic River and down that way. There's a lot of those rivers have big holdover populations. But we also had maybe 6-7 years ago, we had a big population of fish where we had one of those deep freezes where the temperature just dropped and it went to like zero, and one of the tributary rivers, I guess the fish couldn't handle it, and you had like several thousand striped bass die just because that temperature drop happened really fast, and the river maybe it wasn't deep enough, and that was it for them. But we do have a lot. I'll actually start my season usually second week of April. I'll do 3 weeks of fishing, and those fish that we're catching are actually fish that have held over, and now they're getting active, and they usually drop out around the. Usually it happens like the last few days of April. They drop out and they all head north too.
Interesting. That's interesting. So maybe even those first pushes of fish that we're seeing are fish that are holding over in your systems.
Wouldn't
That's really
surprise me.
interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's like clockwork. Usually late April, all those fish drop out. The majority of those fish, and some of those rivers have. I don't know the numbers, obviously, but if I had to guesstimate, it's in the millions. I mean, we drive through with side imaging, and it's. I mean, like some of the schools are a half a mile long, and it's huge schools of fish.
Interesting. Interesting. Do you get your first fish of fish? I'm assuming are Hudson fish that are showing up. Your big fish, right? Like post spawn
I
Hudson
believe
fish.
so. I
Yeah.
believe so. Yeah, I know we always catch the tagged fish that I have caught in June are Hudson River tags
Yeah. That makes
typically.
sense. That makes sense. And they must be. Do they get? I mean, you'd assume they interact with those bunker schools that you have, and I know, from fishing with you, your knowledge and expertise with fishing those baits, and they're not an easy bait to fish, by the way. It's really interesting, or to catch in good numbers. You got to be good with a very heavy cast net. Um, those fish initially they must be incredibly aggressive on those bunkers because they got to put their fat stores back on and they must be chewing. Have you noticed that, or is it more of a finesse fishing situation early?
Man, it's interesting. Those are really good questions. So what's interesting about it is I've seen this where those we'll mark these fish in it'd be late May, early June. It's the first schools of big fish that show up, and they're big schools of fish, and most people don't even know they're there because they're so big you wouldn't even you'd mistake it for the bottom basically. And those first few days, a lot of times, we've gotten on those fish and they won't bite. You
Hmm.
would think they would just be chewing, they'd be obvious, and they'd be blowing bait out of the way. It's not like that. Some of the fish I've seen this in that early season and in the summer too. But some of those fish are just staging, and they're just sitting in the channels, not actively feeding, not actively chasing schools of bait. And then every now and then, a school of bunker will come out and they'll go bonkers, but they're not really chasing bait hard. It could be because I speculate that once stripers get above a certain size, once they're in the 30-inch and 40-inch range, they're not expanding the same amount of energy as a smaller fish. They're not going to go chasing schools of bait around.
Right.
Um, but I don't know why they're just sitting there. I don't know what they're feeding on when they're doing that, because a lot of times those fish are just seems like they're just staging, and then that'll transition, and there'll be times where more migratory show up, and some bluefish show up, and some more bunkers show up, and then they just go crazy, and then it's like that mayhem fishing where they have the feedback on and they're just going bonkers.
Huh. That's interesting. So it's almost like they're because my initial suspicion would be they're acclimating themselves to the environment as they're first showing up and kind of getting used to where they're at. It's actually something I used to see a lot with the tuna fish. When the tuna fish would first get into an area, you'd see them a lot splashing on the surface, but they'd be really scattered and they'd be breezing a little bit, and you'd mark them, but they wouldn't be feeding that hard. And then the really interesting thing that would happen is after a finite amount of time, they would settle in and they'd become more structure oriented and they'd have patterns and movements throughout their day. And that was my initial suspicion. But from listening to what you said, it seems like there's something else going on where they require a certain level of biomass to come in with them, which then will begin kind of their hunting thing.
Yeah, no, that makes sense too. It's interesting how it seems like when they first show up, those first few days, they're not feeding. And like you said, I don't know if it's is it an adjustment period. Not really sure. There's just some things I don't know if
Yeah.
I don't know why. I see it, but I'm not sure how to explain it. But another interesting thing when you mentioned about another biomass of fish showing up. Another thing we've seen is when bluefish show up, usually the bass feed more heavily when there's a few
Competition.
blues mixed in. Maybe
Yeah.
it's a competitive thing. Maybe the bluefish they start feeding, and then it triggers something with the stripers to start feeding as well.
That's interesting. The other interesting thing too is you are so good with your electronics, and your work with Humminbird, and additionally such a consummate professional in your understanding of your tools and how to use them. You know them as well as anyone I've ever met. Um, One would assume that the options that are availed to you through this technology lets you kind of target separate a lot of those bottom hugging fish, huh? Like it seems like they would be
Absolutely,
very
yeah.
very hard to detect with a standard deucer.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I mean, I'm really big on the electronics. I mean, I have three transducers in the boat. So it's definitely taken it to a next level. There's a couple things. I mean, you have the actual machine itself, the unit. What I do think it was this is as unbiased as I could be, but I do think that their side imaging, the Humber side imaging, is really leading the industry with the mega imaging and everything. I mean, it's really fantastic. But even just having good 2D and as well as the down imaging and being able to separate, it's very common where striped bass they will hug the bottom. Their eyes are slightly oriented towards the top of the skull, so they feed up, I believe. So they look up. So when you're fishing a bait off the bottom, a lot of times you want your bait, 5-6 feet off the bottom, and then they're going to move up and grab that bait. But they can, I guess my point being, they can stack up and sit on that bottom where you could drive over them very easily. But I think there's two parts. You have the actual machine itself, and then you have your interpretation of the machine, right?
Right.
So it's the user behind it. It's like you have a computer, and then it's the person using the computer. So I think that's something where it's just time. I mean, I think I was doing the math once, and I think since I've been using the Humminbird stuff, I have about 10,000 hours of looking at the machine.
Yep.
So through those 10,000 hours, I've learned to decipher another uh, thing is when they're on boulders, what the side imaging looks like when stripers are in boulders. It's really easy for that they blend in to the boulders. So that just takes, there's really no shortcut. It just took looking at that machine over and over and over again, and all of a sudden you start to notice different patterns, and you notice things stand out from the surrounding bottom. It's like, oh, wait, that's not boulders. That's actually a school of like, you know, 3,000 stripers there. But it's really easy to miss it. So it's one is having the machine, having the right tools, and the other thing is learning how to use the tools. I think is equally as important.
Is there a certain thing that you're looking for to discern that boulder? Like, is it movement that you're looking for? Or is it
So with side imaging, the optimal reading speed is going to be 2 to 6 or 7 miles an hour. Uh, Faster than that, it's not going to read well. If you're dead drift, you can mark fish at dead drift as well, but everything's going to be elongated and more drawn out. Um, if the trolling motor is running or your engine's with the engine running steady, you won't get it, but you could get electrical interference, and that's something that every boat produces a certain amount of electrical interference. So you have to kind of. It's pretty easy. It kind of fuzzes the screen out. So sometimes you have to look at, like when I run all the transducer cables, I separate it from everything else to try to eliminate any of that interference. But in terms of finding the actual the fish and on so if they're on a sand bottom or a mud bottom, it's really obvious, and that's one thing that the hummingbird machine does really well is that it shows the marks real. I mean, it almost looks like a little goldfish cracker. You could actually kind of see the head and the tail section of the fish, so it comes out really pops nicely. The bowlers, it gets trickier because it blends in more. So what you're looking for is you're looking for a it's going to be you're going to have your bottom, and then you're going to notice something that looks different from the surrounding bottom. So and the more you look at it, the more you'll understand it. But it's like it'll be different from the surrounding bottom, and that'll be your school of fish. And you also look for shadows too, because if you think of just a basic explanation of the side imaging and sonar, right? It's like think of a flashlight shining off your boat, and it hits an object, and then it casts a shadow. So sometimes you'll just see a an area, and there's a big black shadow behind it, and that could be a boulder, or it could be a 10-foot wall of fish. That's because stripers do stack up in these really dense schools, and you'll just have this black spot behind it, and that's where you'll be like, oh wow, that's a huge school. And also, if you ever do this, I mean, it's not good if you don't want spear fishermen around you when you're trying to striper fish. But it is kind of funny where a guy will pop up, like a guy that's scuba diving or spear fishing. He'll be like, "Oh my God, there's a huge school of fish," and it's like, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, that confirms what I'm seeing on my screen right there. Thanks." you
That's
know,
awesome.
yeah,
That must have been a learning curve too, because if you've got the goldfish cracker, that's pretty easy to identify that that's a
yeah,
fish, right? But when you have that large wall, it must be fairly easy to initially be like, "Oh, that's too obvious," or that has to be
yeah.
something that's structural, not a biomass of fish.
100%. That's a big thing. Another big thing, actually, one of the most, probably one of the most important things, and the biggest question when people come on the boat is they look at the screen, and these are even like guys that are experienced fishermen. They look at the electronics and they say, they're like, "Oh, these are fish, right?" Just say you're on your regular sonar unit, not even talking
Right.
about having just your traditional 2D sonar. And I'm like, "Oh no, that's not fish. That's so you have a sensitivity adjustment. Sometimes it's called gain
Hmm.
adjustment. I like to set that threshold kind of in the middle where I want some clutter. So I want those blues and yellows and greens to kind of pop a little bit. Your real mark's going to be red. So and you could change the palette too and change color. I'm talking about the standard palette
Right.
that I use. It's
Right.
your bottom is so your bottom is your main color. That's the red. When you're marking fish, whether it's bait fish or game fish, it's going to show up as red. Um, the blues and yellows, a lot of times, that's just turbidity in the water. I have that sensitivity set on the higher side because I want a little clutter on the screen, not too much. If you go too high, your whole screen will be blacked out. But you want it so you could interpret what's a fish. If you set it too low and you have a nice clean screen, sometimes um, you risk maybe missing fish. I mean, if you had it set all the way down to zero, you could have a whale swim under the boat. You might not mark it.
Yep.
So I want it set a little higher, but you have to understand all these little blue streaks, yellows, and greens. When you drive through the inlet and there's all that's just turbidity in the water. That's not fish. Your fish are going to be red marks. And also, once you have the knowledge of the area, then you could start to get better at identifying what species it is. So, general, if you're in an area where there's a lot of bunker at Menhaden, you're going to mark that because it's going to be a big cloud, smaller marks tight together. Your game fish are going to be larger marks, more target separation. Your something like a bluefish is going to be higher in the water column generally. Stripers hang real tight to the bottom generally. So you could start to kind of make these generalizations. And one thing that's challenging, go back to your first question, when you go to a new area. So I'm fishing in Vero Beach, Florida right now for the off season, and because I'm not as familiar with the baits and the fish that are in and out of season, it's harder. I'm going through the end. I'm like, what is this? Is this bait? Oh, I can't figure this out. I'm marking all these fish. Like, there's thousands of these. Are these all, hopefully these are all pilchards or something like this for bait. What is it? Are these, jacks in the, and it turns out they're catfish.
Right.
Millions and millions of those. They're awful. You don't want to catch these catfish. That's the sail catfish with the spines on them. But
Oh,
it's
and they're
like,
full of
oh,
slime. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. So then you start to learn the area. It's like, all right, this is what catfish look on the machine. This is what, tarpon are real. They mark really, really nice in the machine because they're such a big fish. So you could start to see the different species, but that's part of the learning process too. You're not going to be as effective. I'm way more dialed in my home waters than I am down here, but because I have a better understanding of what's in the water, but I'm still able to pick up the fish and then figure out like, all right, oh, drop a jig down. Oh, this is a catfish. Okay. Oh, that's a jack. That's it.
Right. And then you're imprinting in your mind exactly what the returns are. So now you drive over them again, you're going to be able to say to yourself, that's a catfish mark, that's a jack mark, and,
Yep.
and like you said, tarpon are pretty obvious, the massive swim bladders, the primitive lungs, they're going to give you
Yep.
nice returns.
Yeah.
Speaking of the tarpons, last year we were talking a little bit about, I believe you were on the West Coast, you're in the Tampa area last year,
Yep.
and you went and fished Cape Sable and those rivers down there for the early season tarpons. What was it like kind of learning that area and figuring that out? Because that's a lot of water down there and it's not easy
Yeah.
to learn.
That was cool. That was actually 2020, believe it or not.
Okay.
It's
Okay. 2 years ago.
2 years ago. Yeah. But that was a lot of fun. I had fished the Everglade National Park a few times with a buddy of mine that guides down there. So I had
Huge help.
a
Yeah.
little understanding, but it's different when you're on somebody else's boat and they're the captain versus when you go down there, you're like, hold on, wait. Uh, but that was pretty cool because that's probably my favorite place I fished. Probably maybe anywhere in the world. It's
Same.
just so right. It's so, how do you describe it? Untouched. The environment, um, the
Wild.
the biodiversity. It really is. That's one place that's truly wild to me. It was like when we were planning, getting ready to do the trip. I'm like, we got to have some ice, extra water, and food. Because like, what if you break down? You're kind of in the middle of nowhere. You might not be able to see another boat for, if you might not see if it was in the evening, you wouldn't see another boat probably till the next morning.
Yeah. And there's
Um,
a lot of wood and oyster bars and all kinds of stuff that could go
yeah,
wrong on you down there.
yeah. But I mean, you get to the boat ramp in Flamingo in the national park, and it's like you get to the entrance of the park. It's 40 miles to the boat ramp, which is pretty crazy because I never drive 40 miles to the boat ramp, even if I'm traveling to another boat ramp in Connecticut. Like I launched out in New London, which is like 20 minutes from my house, but it's like 40 miles just to get to the ramp from the park entrance. You get to the ramp and you're launching the boat, and I'm walking down, and I'm like, oh, that's a crocodile right there.
Yeah.
Like there's these residential like 6-7 foot crocodiles just hanging out the boat ramp. Like no big deal. It's I mean, you see everything from crocodiles to manatees, sea turtles. There's cobia. There's tarpon. Who knows? I mean, all kinds. Every species of shark. I mean, it's really a incredible, um, you know, diverse environment down there.
It is. It's really challenging too. It's so sensitive to weather patterns there. Really
Yeah,
makes it.
those
Yeah. Go ahead.
the first day I know we had talked and I ran west through Whitewater
Whitewater.
Bay, Oyster Bay, and all that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And first day I did it on my own. We hooked three tarpon artificials. We fished mullet and hooked another 6 or 7. I think we had 10 hookups. Landed maybe 3.
Yeah. Yep.
But um, that was the first day, and then I went back the following week and the week after that, and never hooked another tarpon.
Huh, no kidding. Yep.
Yeah, beginner's luck, I guess.
Was that March?
Oh yes, it was. Yep. Yeah, I think it
Yeah.
was early. It was early March. I think I went the first 3 weeks of March. It was the first week, second week, and third week. And that first week of March was the best.
Makes
The best trip.
sense. Did it
Yeah.
did it warm up a good bit? Do you remember if it warmed up between those months?
I
I mean
don't
those
I
weeks?
don't recall specifically. I mean, I think the weather was getting more stable. It was definitely warming up in March.
Yeah.
And it was the days when I've done better, and even previously when I fished it on my buddy's boat, it was always the warmer weather seemed to be warm, consistent weather was when we had the best days. And then I mean, one time we were down there. This is probably like 2015, 2016. We had one day, we had another real good day where we had a bunch of hookups, and then went back the next day. It was real windy and didn't see a fish.
Yeah.
Big
Just
temperature drop, wind picked up, and they were gone.
yep. Yep. Shivering somewhere out in the Gulf trying to warm up.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah,
You must have used your side scan quite a bit and that when you were, kind of around that Oyster Bay, Shark River kind of area trying to figure where
yeah.
the fish were, huh?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's two ways to go about it. The side imaging is really useful, and it's probably underutilized amongst the flats skiff fishermen, because they're very visual oriented.
Yeah.
Ideally, you want to take both. You want to use both to your advantage, because I remember hearing, might have been Flip Pallet said this, but he's like, some people go out and they're so glued to their electronics or whatever, their phone, whatever it is that they're looking for the fishing information too, that they miss all the environment and all the environmental factors that are happening around them. So you need to do both. You need to utilize the technology advantage. If you're not using it, you're putting yourself at such a disadvantage to what you could be. But at the same time, you have to learn to be um, observant of your environment, um, because that's key too. So with the tarpon, we did both. We saw them rolling and marked them on side imaging. And with the side imaging, it's nice because, like, hey, marking on the starboard side of the boat, cast that way. So you
Yep.
you could really hone in and pinpoint it. But we also saw a lot of fish rolling too. We were looking for that kind of stuff. Looking for pelicans hitting the water and seeing how they're reacting. If they're diving on glass minnows, they behave a little differently than if they're diving on pilchards, and kind of looking for that kind of stuff as well.
Interesting. So you're using the environmental clues to figure out where to fish and then cross-referencing that with your electronics to pinpoint exactly within that larger area where they're at.
Yeah, 100%. And just
Yeah.
full disclaimer, I am by no means an expert on fishing the Everglades or fishing down south. I'm
Right.
but I think going back to your point of trying to take something from a different area and apply it somewhere else is the point. But yeah, I mean, I do that in where I fish in Connecticut, all the time, where I'm looking for both the environmental. You have to have the awareness to what's happening around you, and then also the electronics. I mean, they're both equally as important.
Yeah. And that's interesting too. So it's interesting to listen to the perspective that you're gaining through the different fisheries and taking it into what you do. It's also interesting to hear how you talk about your experience over the years. I mean, you've been guiding full time now for a good amount of time, and you're definitely at the highest level of the profession. What's interesting about it is that I find a lot of people at that level, the more you see, the less you know, kind of deal, right? The you never be as certain as of your abilities as you are when you're like a advanced intermediate kind of deal, right? Um,
Yeah.
and how is your philosophy and your approach changed, as you've developed and rounded into the form that you're presently in?
um Yeah, so that, like, so you were saying, it made me think of this. As a friend of mine said this, and this goes back to, I think it's an ancient Greek uh, philosophy. Is the more you learn, the more you realize how much you don't know,
Yep.
because you become more aware of your own ignorance.
Yep.
It's like that. Sometimes the most ignorant person is it's the it's when you don't know anything, you're aware of your ignorance. Then you start to get good at something. That's when you become unaware, because you think you got, like, oh, I really got it all figured out. But then if you push back past that point, you got to control your ego. That's, some people can't. Yeah, that's hard. But then you're like, oh wait, I don't know that much. You go somewhere else. Oh wow, I didn't know that. I didn't know this. There's a lot. And then you start, all these different questions start to come into your mind. I think that's when you really start to, that shows a deeper understanding, because then you start to think outside the box, outside of what what you read in the magazine and what you hear and what you see online, then you're asking yourself all these different questions. So that opens up all these other possibilities. And that's what makes fishing to me, um, why I enjoy the sport of fishing, and just in life, I like learning new things. So I think with fishing is there's always something new to learn. Like everybody likes being proficient and being good at what they're doing, but the ability to always learn more and kind of hone those skills, I think, is what keeps it interesting. But I may have gone on a little bit of a tangent there. What
No, that's great, man.
circle
That's
back to
great.
your question? Yeah,
No, it's true though. It's really the learning, and as you be, I think so much of it is really learning anything, any profession, any skill, any hobby. When you progress through that, that advanced beginner is the most insufferable person on the planet because they
right.
think they know everything, right? And then it's the Dunning-Kruger curve, right? You peak, and the height of your confidence is when you're a beginner, intermediate, advanced beginner, and then it goes down to, oh my god, I know nothing, and then it
Mhm.
accumulates and builds up from there to true competency and confidence, right? And what's interesting about the still learning thing is you see guys that are really kind of, you go through a thing of you want to earn some credibility and you want to have some acknowledgement. And then once you've had that, the only thing that matters to you from there is refining your skill set. And what happens is you have enabled yourself to have creativity because of your experience. You might have seen something 7 years ago in some weird situation that you made an adaptation to that stuck in your brain and you're going to remember it forever. And you're going to see something, 7 years down the road that has some crossovers to that situation that you can pull from and adapt to that. And that's where the continuation of the learning really occurs, right? Where you
Yeah,
can have that creativity. And that's where it gets really fun when you start making up your own stuff.
yeah, yeah. So I would say another thing that um, helped me out a lot is I had a pretty good experience to get some really good clients when I started guiding, and then have invited me on trips that they booked. So I got to fish Louisiana, the Keys a bunch, Costa Rica, Panama. So I've fished with a bunch of, what some of the top names in the industry are. So then you go with those guys and you see how they are. And the one thing I've noticed, the commonality with all the top professionals is that they have a very nuanced they're nuanced and they have a great attention to detail.
Right.
Um, and you'll see that with the bait rigging and just how they kind of know, like, all right, you pulled the bait too quick. This is right, this is wrong. We got to drop the kite bait 5 feet, pull it up. They're making those constantly making those adjustments, and that's something I've done where I started looking at. It's not just hooking a bait. Like I do a lot of fishing with live bunker. You mentioned before, it's actually people would say, "Oh, live bait fishing is easy. You just throw it on a hook and send it out there." That's that intermediate guy that doesn't really get it yet, because live bunker fishing, hooking fish on live a striped bass on bunker is really difficult because there's so many things that go wrong. So now I pay attention to, all right, it's got to be hooked this way. The hook it needs to be, the perfect angle. This is going to be the bet. We're optimizing the hookup percentage by doing it this way. Um, we need to look at the behavior of the fish, and we need to look at. I talk about the fish behavior a lot, where fish are in high aggression, low aggression, moderate aggression, and oftentimes with striped bass, they're not in that high aggression state where they're blowing when they're in high aggression, you throw a lure out there, they're smashing it. You throw a bait out, they're smashing it. But oftentimes when we fish, they're in low to moderate aggression levels. So, and when that's the case, you got to look at, all right, do I need to pull the bait away? Do I need to troll it? I need to do something to make that animal react to my bait? And a lot of that is that it's that predator prey scenario that you have to try to create and you have to try to figure out.
And a
Um,
lot of that's reading the behavior of the bait fish itself.
Yeah, so you'll look at your bait. It's cool too when they're, well. This happens on the surface and below the surface a lot, obviously. So below the surface is a little different because you might, it's all feel. or you're using your electronics in that scenario. But when they're on the surface, you could see the bass going after the bait, and you could kind of see it. It's nosing it, it's smacking it, but it's not committed to swallowing it. So you have to do something to either create that reaction strike, or you notice the fish, you're getting the bite, and the fish is dropping it. It's like, well, because that fish feels you, so you have to drop the bait back to it with no resistance. That's a
Yep.
hard thing to teach people too. Is like, all right, have your thumb, have it in free spool, have your thumb on it, but no tension. That it's really hard to explain this to people that haven't done it before. No tension on the spool, because if you want to let the fish run with the bait, there has to be no resistance. If the fish feels resistance, it spits the bait.
Yep.
So
Especially with the
yeah,
big bait like a bunker too, being able to differentiate the tail kicks of a nervous bunker from that initial nip bite, right? If the
mm,
fish is coming up and
great
just
point.
tapping it,
Yeah,
it's I mean, there's a you have it takes a lot of fish to be able to delineate the difference in the tactile response.
it's really hard to explain that to people. I still I have trouble. Like I want to get better at putting it into words. It's very hard to verbally explain it. A lot of it is you just feel. A lot of times, what I end up doing, I just grab the rod and I'll just hook the fish and then hand it off to the person, because it could be so hard to try to explain it. And then sometimes they do everything quote unquote wrong and it works. So I mean, there's days where the bite is more aggressive, and the person's holding the rod, or you can have the rod on the rod holder and it's hooking itself. And there's other days where you have to drop the bait back with the fish. You have to let the fish run with it, and they're going to first grab it by the side body, and you have to give it that time to actually swallow it and take it head first. So that's a day-to-day thing that sometimes you have to make that observation on the fly. And they'll be in that, they may be in a certain pattern where it lasts a few days, and then maybe there's a pressure change, and a storm kicks up, and then they're just hammering baits, and you're dropping the rod and just setting the hook right away, because there's no hesitation whatsoever. So that behavior change will occur, and you have to be able to identify that, in real time.
Yeah, 100%. And that's the other thing that you mentioned, is that live bait fishing is one of the more technical aspects in all of fishing. The amount of nuance and detail involved, the opportunities for things to go wrong, even if you do everything right. For example, many times a hook can reverse back into a bait, which is why
Yeah,
the guys that are
that's
more
frustrating.
detail oriented will bridle them or things like
Hmm.
that. Um, if you could consider the things that differentiate a very advanced live bait fisherman from, let's say, your average recreational guy that gets out on the weekends, what are the things that separate the two?
uh Biggest thing is probably bait quality, and you'll see that with all, because mostly all the top guides around the country, around the world, generally live bait fish, because a lot of area parts of the world and areas, the live bait fishing is key. But also, I'll back up, because somebody's going to misinterpret this and be like, "Oh, well, I catch them on slow pitch." Every type of fishing has its nuances. So
Right.
everything,
Right.
fly fishing is extremely nuanced in its own way. Lure fishing, the deep drop jigging, or vertical jigging, and the live bait fishing. But you'll see a lot of game fish react to live bait more consistently than other methods,
Absolutely.
day in and day out across the spectrum. Um, but what the really good guys do is, bait quality is incredibly important. Probably the most, that in presentation, but bait quality is probably number one. So you'll see this down south, where your hook baits are sometimes caught on a sabiki rig. They're dehooked with a dehooker. They're not handled, because you don't want to, especially a bait that isn't as hardy, maybe like a herring or a sardine. You don't want to handle the bait, but you don't want to put it in a cast net. Um, so that the live wells play a critical role. I know one of the things that the boat I'm fishing now, it's a 27 conch, and it has uh massive live wells, like the biggest live wells in that size. So I have a 90 gallon and 110 gallons. I have 200 gallons of live well space. So,
Live chum
but
with bunker.
yeah, exactly. So having that big a live well and that much circulation, my bait quality is really high, and I only want to fish real high bait quality. Guys with smaller live wells, they they overcrowd their live wells or their bait turns red, and then they're fishing around a guy that has real good baits, and they're going to get outfished left and right, and they can't figure it out, and then they're getting mad and they're looking for excuses or this and that. But bait quality is huge. I think how you hook the bait um, is important. How you present it. We do things with the trolling motor to manipulate the drift speed. So sometimes you're drifting too quick. That's no good. Sometimes there's no drift and you got to kind of pull the bait a little bit. So we use the trolling motor a lot for that.
That's interesting.
Um, yeah.
It seems like, given where you fish predominantly, you deal with a ton of water movement. And it
Mhm.
seems like mitigating that water movement and additionally working with that water movement must be a major consideration in what you do.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And well, I mean, one of the big advancements has been having the trolling motor.
Yeah,
So I use a Minn Kota trolling motor. It has everybody knows the term spot lock, but actually, what I use as frequently as the spot lock, or if not more, is actually the autopilot. A lot of times I'm on autopilot because when you're in real high current and you're spot locking, your baits are generally just water skiing behind the boat. It actually
right.
doesn't do you that much good. And it's funny to see guys get a trolling motor and they think, oh, that's all I do. It's like, oh no, it depends on the water movement. Wind's a big thing too. Generally you want to keep a lot of times you want to keep your bait moving. In line with with the current. So if you have a wind, like say you have an outgoing tide and like a north wind, where if you're in a river that runs north to south and you're just getting blowing really fast, downriver, or you could have wind blowing you against the current too. A lot of times that's where you want your trolling motor just to set it at a speed that keeps you drifting at 1.5 knots instead of 3.5 knots because
Right.
the baits are just drifting too quick, and they're like water skiing on the surface.
For sure. And in those situations, will you prefer, because I know typically speaking, the flood tide is a little softer than the ebb tide.
Yep.
Do,
Yeah,
do you
it
have a
is.
do you have a preference between the two, or is it situationally dependent?
Situationally dependent and spot dependent. So in Long Island Sound, the average speed of the ebb or outgoing tide, I believe it's about 1 knot average faster than the flood.
Good bit.
They both fish well. It also is spot specific because certain areas you have better water movement and you'll actually have better velocity on the better velocity and a longer duration of flow on the flood compared to the ebb. A lot of places it's the opposite. So there are spots that do better on one or the other. Um, and then a lot of times it could just be other environmental factors, like we were talking about the water temperature. You get that flood tide; it moves in that warmer or cooler water, versus the outgoing tide is going to push out that warmer or cooler water. So yeah, I think that's another key point too.
Yeah, for sure. Here's a huge aggressive subject change. I was just realizing that one of my favorite series to watch is the series that you did with Humminbird, where they took you guys to, was it El Salto they took you guys
Oh
to?
yeah, the one boat challenge. Yeah,
The one boat
yeah,
challenge. Yeah.
yeah,
Tell
yeah. A couple
tell me a
things.
little bit about that,
Yeah,
man. What was that
yeah,
experience like for you, and what did you learn from fishing with all those
yeah.
different guys?
So we filmed that. It was November 2019.
Yep.
Really awesome experience. But first of all, full disclaimer. Uh, so people don't understand. It was a mini series. There was 4 episodes. It was a high production. They really did top notch. I mean, they had a helicopter. They dropped a boat from a helicopter. I mean, it was cool.
Oh, I was doing the spreadsheets, looking at every shot. I was like, I know
Yeah,
what that costs. I know what that costs. Yep.
yeah, it was pretty
Yep.
serious, and great group of people. But you do have to realize it was a reality show, so it's like the first thing they said to us on day one is, "All right, we want a little banter. We want you to trash talk each other," and so that was it. So depending on how they cut it, you're going to be you'll have a certain persona. So it was like
Got it.
I had something, I don't remember saying it, but I had some just funny one liners that were ridiculous. Like I don't normally talk like that, but in a
Right.
reality show. But it's funny how people watching like, oh man, this guy seems man, he's a trash talker. He seems cocky or something. It's like, well,
Right.
it's a reality TV show. You're kind of putting on a little
I'm
bit of act
playing a
for the camera.
character. This
Yeah,
is pro
exactly.
wrestling
Yeah,
here. Yeah,
yeah. People
exactly.
didn't like. You got to understand that. But and also the guys we had like and girl, we had one girl on the show, Ashley, but Seth, Charlie, I mean those guys are pretty fun guys to be around. So there was a lot of joking around and probably a lot of things that couldn't be on the air that were pretty funny.
Yeah.
Just stuff being said back and forth and this and that. So it was definitely a fun time. Really cool lake. The only unfortunate thing was it's a lot of, I don't do a lot of bass fishing, but we did catch a lot of fish. I mean, it was like, hey, go out, you have a 90-minute challenge. Whoever catches the most fish wins. It was like we caught my partner and I caught 35 fish in 90 minutes, which is good for bass fishing, I presume,
Right.
right? That's really good, right?
One would
But
assume. Yeah.
but we didn't get as much opportunity to fish for big fish as we would have liked, and also because we're doing this high production filming, they wanted ideal light conditions. So most of the actual, and there's a crew of, there was 8 of us on the show. There was about another 35 people on
Just in
the other
support.
side of the camera. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of, you have, 40 people or, 45 people. It's a lot of moving parts. So by the time we would film, it would be like between like 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. Not the most ideal
Right.
time for bass fishing. And some of the biggest bass that were caught that week were caught that when the cameras weren't rolling from like the one of the camera guys messing around on the bank of the river while we were waiting caught like 9-pound
Ugh.
largemouth or something. So
Yeah.
yeah.
That's awesome, man. And you got
Yeah.
to do, what were some other trips you got? You got AFCO took you to Panama for one, right?
Yep.
For a shoot in Panama.
Yeah, that was like, so the Panama shoot was recent. That was in I was there in April 2021. Oh no, I'm sorry, 2022. So yeah, less than a year ago.
Yeah.
Um that was awesome. That film hasn't come out yet. I'm not sure when that one's going to come out, but that was really cool. We fished Toucan Lodge in Panama, and we basically ran out like 50, 60 miles. With the yellowfin tuna fishing was really good. I like doing the rooster fish. I would like to have done more of that. I did get one nice rooster on a topwater. Um, we had Benny Ortiz with us, who's a big slow pitch guy.
Okay.
So we did a lot of that slow pitch jigging, and he got a really big Cubera snapper, like a 40-something pound Cubera.
Oof.
That was cool. He caught a lot of fish, like just broomtail grouper. We caught something called a mullet snapper. A lot of exotic species I've never seen. Bluefin trevally. So it was cool, and just being there, the scenery and the landscape. It's very like Jurassic, similar to Costa Rica, but even less developed than Costa Rica, less
Yeah.
commercialized. So if you get a chance to go to Panama, it's an awesome trip.
It's on the list. So I remember I was like 10 years old and I cracked open a sport fishing magazine and they were talking about Hannibal Bank and they had
Mm.
these photos of these huge surface feeds of mullet snapper.
Yeah.
So the
Oh
mullet
wow,
snapper,
really?
yeah, they were up on the, I guess they're blue runners, what they get offshore, a lot of
Yep.
them down there.
Yeah, yeah.
So the mullet snapper were up and they were balled up like the redfish do in Louisiana. So it was just these crimson tight ball of mullet snapper. And I remember looking at the shape of it and being like, well, that thing's shaped like an amberjack. They must pull like crazy. Was that what the fish was like? 'Cause
Oh yeah,
I've
they're
catch them.
strong. Yeah,
Yeah.
all those fish, all those any species of snapper and grouper fight like crazy. I mean, grouper, I'd say the best comparison if you're from the up north, grouper's like a giant. It's like a tautog on steroids. They're
Right.
so strong. The snapper and the mullet are both really strong. Interesting. They don't use lead with their live baits down there. It's all free line. So like the mullet snapper that we caught, we're on a free lined blue runner. So
Huh.
you're not actually. I mean, the bait does swim down, but you're not actually drifting it on the bottom. So they're pretty aggressive
They're coming up for it.
fish. They're coming up and hitting it. Yeah.
Do you think they're fishing it unweighted so you have a chance to get them out of the structure?
I don't know because I asked about sinkers because I'm all about putting lead on and getting bait near the bottom.
Yeah,
And and he just said, yeah, we just don't fish like that. I forget what his reason was. But yeah, I don't remember specifically. I did learn another interesting fact that Cubera they always release Cubera snapper because they grow. I think it was like 1 pound a year. Because I think the
really.
big fish that Benny caught was like 40 years old. Yeah. Yep.
Wow.
Slow growing fish. We did fish Hannibal Bank. The yellowfin tuna fishing was good out there, and they're nice size yellows. Like I actually had a big one on that was I had one that was about 100 pound class, and that fish on a spinning rod. Um, Spinning rods are not the most practical way to fight a large pelagic. It really puts a toll
No,
on your
they're not.
body.
No, they're
And
not.
I fought that one for an hour and 20 minutes and then lost it both. It was like I was probably one revolution of the reel handle away from gaffing it. And but there's some big yellow fins out there. And another interesting thing, although there's a lot of commercial tuna fishermen out there, and they drag out um, trees. They have trees tied up to their boat like tree trunks, and they drag them out because they go to an area where there's a bait fish. They get the bait fish to swim under the trees of the boat. Then they go out to the bank, and so they have their own basically chum around the boat that are hanging out under the trees. They have all the small bait fish that will actually just sit under the trees, and that draws in the tuna.
And the tunas would just sit there and pulverize the bait that's trying to get whatever structure it can.
Yeah, yeah,
Man, that's efficient, huh?
yeah. Isn't
Their
that?
own FADs.
It's
That's
like a
funny.
fad attached to your boat.
Yeah, I can't beat that. Man, I tell you, when you tell me the story about that 100-pound yellowfin, I have horror story memories. So in 2011, when I was guiding, full time, we had a push of bluefins come in inshore, and they were the only ones that were around, and they were all 71 to 72 inches, and they
Oh
were
wow.
eating 2-inch sea herring, and it's the only thing they were so keyed in on the small bait. The only thing you catch them on is little metal. And so like every trip, it was like the guys were gassed up to go get a tuna. And I was kind of like, guys, look, we're catching these things on the only way we catch these things on a spin rod, unless you want to put a kite up with a mackerel and wait for 3 hours for one to intersect with the mackerel. But it's like, I'd rather go chase them around a little bit. But man, it's like you start getting a fish that's up around 60 inches, 65, 70. That curve of pain goes exponentially
Yeah,
up. The second they hit like 58 inches, it's just hell from there.
yeah. It's like you don't realize how hard it is to actually fight a fish like that without passing the rod off. I think fighting it with a belt is completely different because there's a fighting belt and a harness, gimbal and harness. It's totally different because it's all legs. But when you're doing one without, like, you just put a cushion on the bottom of the rod seat and
Oh
you're just
God,
hanging out of
no.
the rod, I mean, it torques your lower back incredibly and your arms, but because you're constantly, you're holding the rod and saying your right hand or whatever hand, your left hand, right hand, doesn't matter, but you're constantly fighting that pull on one side, and it's yeah, it's really taxing on your body to do that.
That's brutal. They just gave you a cushion. We'd use
Yeah.
the but so Braid made a strap and so did AFTCO. And the
Yep.
strap would go around the reel seat in front of
Yep.
the stem of the reel. And so
Yeah.
we could
Yeah.
we could clip in with that and harness up. And even in the harness, because the it's such an inefficient lever, it's a 7-foot lever.
Yep.
And just the amount of strain to be on you with those fish, even harnessed up like that, it's just like, dude, stick it in the rod holder. If it's if it's
Just fight
bigger
it.
than
Yeah.
120 pounds, it's on a 50 and stuck in the rod holder. It's like,
Right. Yeah.
no, I'm meat
Yeah.
fishing. Yeah.
Yeah. I would like to maybe once in my life, I would like to get either, I say this now, I don't know, like a swordfish or a tuna stand up just to say I did it. But everybody that's done it has been like, you don't want to do that. I'd like to do. I think it'd be cool to do it once, but maybe I'm just, you know, biting off more than I could chew. But
You mean like a giant, like a true like 500
like a
plus?
500 pound, and strapped into a harness and actually do one like that would be cool.
Yeah.
I did a Goliath grouper in Isla Mirada years ago. on a in a fighting chair, and that was the only time I ever used the fighting chair. But that was actually kind of cool because you do get some. It does actually like you get some pull. Like I could see why people that blue marlin fish, get the excitement of being in a chair like that as opposed to fighting it out of a rod holder. But
For sure.
it's the only time I've ever done that.
Yeah. No, it's good, man. I mean, you're in shape. It's good to do once, get it, just
Yeah,
tack it on the resume so you can say you've done it. And then when the experience is over and you're laying in a beanbag and you're saying
you're
to
like,
yourself, oh,
no,
thank
never
God
again.
that's over. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you know what the problem is if you try to do it, you would even like say a swordfish because now they have the electric reels that you could switch to manual so you use the electric to drop it up and down. But the
Hand
problem
crank
is
them up. Yeah.
you're going to spend all that time and then you could be out there, all day you're waiting for a bite, so you could be out there for 7 hours or whatever, and then you finally get a bite. Now you're fighting the fish now you're 12 hours invested into into the day. You fight it, and then you get broke off, and that's it.
Right.
You killed your body, spent 12 hours plus all the money and this and that, and you had your chance, and then you lose it. I mean, that's part of the game with that kind of offshore fishing.
For sure. Especially the swords. It seems like the swords come unbuttoned. I'd love to talk to a professional sword fisherman about it
Yeah,
because it seems like they come unbuttoned a lot more than the tunas do.
yeah. I don't know too much about it. I got yeah. There's a bunch of guys down here in Florida
Yeah, you're in
that
Mecca.
are into
Yeah.
that. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And Bobby Boyle down there and the Lauderdale, the West Palm guys, the
yep,
Miami guys, that's kind of where it's at. And, Nick Stancic down in Isla
yep,
Morada. Yeah,
yeah.
it's they got a cool fishery, man.
I did do a striped marlin. I caught a couple striped marlin of 2018. I was in Australia, and I got one stripe that was about 100 kilos. I think that was about 220 pounds. And that was my first time catching a marlin, and that was in it was stand up. It was a 30. I think it was 30-pound mono, but the drag, I think the drag was set a little loose because that was a 2 hour. That was my longest fight. That was a 2 hour and 20 minutes. Um, we were also fishing a tournament, so I think we didn't want to like risk losing it because it was a good fish. But that was cool. That was all stand up. That was I mean I was spent after that. And marlin are I've never seen fish move so quick. I mean that thing was jumping off the starboard side of the boat, and then I mean, literally a second later, I'm like, that's the fish on the port side of the boat, and I'm trying to run around
That's crazy.
clear the motors to get around everything. It was pretty wild.
That's crazy. That's cool. They're very cool fish, man. Um, Mike, I have another question for you. Bringing around here, right? What do you think the current skill gaps are? Like if we were to identify the major deficiencies, right, of most anglers, we'll call them average recreational
Mm-hmm.
anglers, right? If we were to identify the one skill that we could improve upon in the general populace to make them significantly better, what skill do you think that would be?
It's a good question. Um, hmm. Well, this is what comes to mind. First thing that comes to my mind is this: is that there's we I'm gonna say like we live in a different era now where
Yeah.
I like the old school guys. Like I'm a fan of like Sherwood Lincoln was a Long Island Sound commercial guy, really great fisherman. Or like Charlie, we did that video a few years ago with Charlie Soares and like, Tim Coleman, and that so guy like Sherwood say that commercially fished. They were you talk to them about fishing, they're really have a real high level understanding. They were really dialed in because they relied so much on environmental observations. They didn't have the technology. They didn't have the fishing reports. They didn't share information. They threatened each other with shotguns if you know what I mean. It was much more secretive. If somebody came in your spot, it was different. It was more cutthroat. But they were really good fishermen. Like when you talk to them, they really understand the the fishing on a high level in the environment and the behavior of the fish. I think, well, one thing, the advantage to say a newer era fisherman, today's fisherman, is that you have a tremendous amount of information. And that's maybe a pro and a con, but you could learn so much online, and there's so much like fishing reports and people that share information that you could get in on bites and figure things out fairly quickly. And another thing too is it's more common now. You may like this or not like it, but it's people. Every area is different, but I know where I fish, people do fish closer to each other than I think they used to. So people will be like, oh, there's so and so, and there, there's the boats. I go and fish in that area. So you could find the bites, but I think what's being neglected now is like I think that real deep understanding, like the old school sharpies, you call them. I think that's being maybe a lost art now because now you have a lot of people with a lot of information that are successful fishermen and they're good fishermen, but they can't develop that real deep understanding to figure it out. They won't go out and figure a fishery out on their own and learn something new, learn something that a new spot or something that isn't kind of public knowledge because you have to have the ability to observe, kind of like what we were talking about before, observe, process it, and then make a decision, tweak something and do something different. And I think that's the downside. So it's a pro and con. There's access to a lot of information, but if you were to pick their brain, they don't have that deep, nuanced understanding to be able to what's the word? Innovate. Like the old
Correct.
school guys, they were innovators, and I think that maybe somewhat being lost today. And I think
Yeah.
I think for a lot of guys, it's like um, stop, think about why as opposed to where. Think about why they're there, why they're hitting the bait, and then try to innovate and try to do something new. And also, you have to be willing. This is hard to do, but you have to be willing to go out and fish and not catch anything. That's what it takes to learn. You want to find a new sea bass spot? All right, you're going to have to go look on the chart. You're going to hit, 8 or 9 spots, and 8 of them aren't going to be good. 7 or 8 of them won't be good, and you're going to find one good one. You got to invest a whole day to find it, but then you might find a good spot. So, and that's challenging for some people. That it's like, oh, I only have one day to fish. I want to try to maximize it, whatever. But if you want to kind of try to take it to the next level, I think that's something is you have to be willing to kind of go out and try different things and ultimately looking at the bigger picture, but you have to put time in and there's going to be days where you go out and you don't catch anything.
Yeah, I think that comes down to being process oriented as opposed to reward oriented.
Mm,
And in so many things, if you want to make a big leap in a skill progression, your result will have to take a couple steps back for a little while, and you're going to have to be
yeah,
okay with that. But the end result of investing, let's say, 6 months into something, you're going to be significantly more competent as a result of that time investment that will pay significant dividends down the road.
100%. Yeah, it's about playing the long game.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mike, you got anything to plug?
I'm trying to think. We covered a lot there. I was going to ask you one thing about you brought
Yeah.
this up, but so you fished that fishery, the bluefin tuna fishery,
Yeah.
in like that '08, '07, '08, '09 when that was really kind of was that the beginning of the jig and pop where it really started to kind of '05 ish is where that kind of because I didn't think prior to that was it really happening
So
much.
I caught my first fish on a spin rod in 2003.
Okay.
The guys that I came up under were Nat Moody and Derek Spingler from First Sight
Yeah.
Anglers, who are out of Gloucester. They are regarded, at least north of Cape Cod. There were a few guys
Hmm.
on Cape Cod that was happening at the same time. Nat and Derek were regarded as the inventors of that fishery. They started seeing they would fish commercially for giants in the
Yeah.
summertime, and this was I think their first fish might have been 97, 98.
Hmm.
Um, on light tackle. But so they would go down to the race in October and guide for albies after our season would end.
Hmm.
Um, and so they learned how to fish for those down there. And they were also in North Carolina as well for a while. But they would be running back from giant fishing and they'd be seeing these 40, 50 pounders splashing on the way back. And so they began figuring out, how they were going to go about catching them. And I believe at the time, the best technology that we had were fly rods because spinning gear
Mm-hmm.
at the time was still monofilament. This was the
Yep.
very infancy of braided line. I think spider wire was the only Spectra player in the game at the time. And that was
Yep.
still very, they hadn't really figured out how to get the braid to lay limp yet, and it was still not quite there. So they began catching these fish on fly rods in the late 90s, which you think about
Wow.
how impressive that is, right?
Yeah.
And at the time, the fly lines they had their breaking strength cores. I think they were 30-pound breaking strength cores. They worked with Rio to develop the Leviathan line that has a 65-pound breaking core, and so they began to adapt a lot of their tackle. And then towards the early aughts, '02, '03, '04, there were generally speaking mixed size classes that would show up with good consistency. Let's say average 40 to 120, 130 pounds, but the majority of the fish would be between 40 and 70 pounds.
Hmm.
And that's when the braid began to take over. And they were using Stellas because they were guides,
Yep.
but everyone else was using. I remember the first reel that I had for it was a Penn 9500 on an ugly stick tiger. Was the first setup that
Yeah.
I had,
Yeah. Yep. The
and
Pen 9500. That's funny.
yeah, Penn 90, not even a
Yeah.
950, right? It was a
Yeah.
9500.
Yeah.
And we were using 40-pound braid, and I felt like I had cable because prior to that, we were using 12-pound test for them.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
there were the other thing too is there were no specific tuna lures made. So what we were
Mhm.
using were Yozuri hydro metals, Yozuri hydro poppers,
Yep.
and wooden spooks and things like
Yep.
that the custom plug makers were making because those were the only things that were through wired were the custom plug making guys.
Yep.
So that was that fishery from '04, 02, '03, '04. And then in 2005, there was a massive year class of fish that appeared initially off the Westport River and in Newport. And they were all like 26, 27 inches.
Mm.
And it was
Oh
an
wow. That's
absolutely
cool.
ridiculous size class of fish. I
Yeah.
mean, millions of them. And
Yeah.
those fish eventually matriculated north and they were off Chatham for a while and then they were up on Stellwagen and then they were up off New Hampshire and Maine and and they settled in. And we said, wow, what a crazy year that was. The only fish that were around were 25 pounders. And
That's
so the
fun.
following year happened, 2006 happened, and they were all 46, excuse me, they were all like 35, 36 inches. And the same thing happened. And then 2007 came, and in 2007, they were all 47, 48 inches. 2008, they were 53, and it continued like that. And so what happened was because none of us really had the experience with innovating the tackle required for fish of this nature and this size and the methods with which we were targeting them, there was a big innovation in line technology, reel technology, rod technology. The guys from First Light got heavily involved with Shimano, and they had a lot of influence in the development of the Saragossa, which came out in 2008. And that was kind of the price point tuna reel. That was you'll get a really good reel that can stand up to these fish for I think it was like $300 retail, something
Yeah.
like
You
that.
can't. You can't beat the Gosa. I use them. That's like my main charter reel. Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're awesome. I still have like three Gosas up in my tackle room from back in the day.
Yeah.
But what was cool about it is that every year they came back, they did something different. So one year it was purely casting, and then another year it was purely jigging with sluggos. Another year it was a troll bite. Another year it was a live bait bite. So what happened is these were all novel methods at the time. A lot of guys would, trolling spreader bars and things like that with the troll bite, which is effective, but guys began developing other ways of doing it, the X wraps and sluggos, and guys were
Hmm.
fishing ballyhoo and things like
Yeah.
that. So what happened was is that we would get these situations thrown at us on an annual basis. Then there was no book written on how to do it, man. They were just there doing it, and then we just go. I mean, I say we because I was a part of it, but really the true professionals, the very experienced guys, the more senior guides, were the ones that were driving the true innovation. And what happened was is that every year that came out, there would be a new skill set that would be developed and refined. They'd show up in August, and by, let's say, Columbus Day, we'd have it really refined, right? And it'd be
Wow.
new gear, new tactics, new approach, different bite windows, different light settings that they like, different winds, because tuna change what they are every size class. And this was all so new and fresh to us. And there were so many of them out there. You could go out, and once you start getting good at it, you were fishing over enough fish where you'd get really positive confirmation on your stuff. It's not like you were going out there and not fishing over anything. You could have been doing it right, but you wouldn't know. With that, there were so many fish that you could get good in a hurry. So that explosion was huge. The jig and pop culture started getting big like '08, '09, 10. And they started adapting a lot of their Japanese style stuff. We were still using CalStar rods. The
Hmm.
CalStar Graphiter 700H was the blank, had a
Yeah, I
glass tip
remember
on it.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, had a
Yep.
glass tip on it, so it flex a little better.
Heavy,
Um,
really heavy.
oh, total freaking yeah. I mean, it was like a
Yeah,
baseball bat. Yeah.
like two
Yep.
pounds. Yeah.
Oh yeah, it was brutal, man. Brutal. And
Yeah.
then they'd be like, "I'll go out there and jig," and I had like the graphiters, and I'm like, "No, I get 50s and I can fish live bait. No, I'm not gonna
Yeah.
do that."
Yeah.
Yeah, and so that progressed from that until it was 2011, 2010. 2010, they all showed up and they were 72 inches.
Wow.
And they were eating little herring and stuff, and that was brutal, but good fishing. And then 2011, they vanished, and that year
Hmm.
class never came back. I think, some of the people that have more experience, kind of in the later part of the teens. I don't know if the fish that we're seeing now, because I know the giant fishing is as good as it's ever been right now
Yeah.
around here. Um, I'm not out there enough to make a good gauge on it, but some of the things I'm hearing is that these fish might be the offspring of those
Hmm.
fish that we're having around here as the giants.
Wow.
The other thing is the bait was different then. We had a lot of offshore sand deals. We had a lot of peanut bunker. We had very small mackerels. We had more butterfish, things like that. Now we've prohibited midwater trawlers from being inside of a certain range in the Gulf of Maine. So our herring and mackerel have really come back very well offshore. And obviously, with that being the larger bait, I think that's attracting a lot more of the giants.
Hmm.
So that's the story of how that fishery came to be, man. It was pretty crazy. In '08, how popular it was. I remember going out to Stellwagen in the fall of '08 on a Saturday morning and being 6 mile, maybe 4 miles off the structure and seeing a few running lights, and I'm like, oh, it's not that bad today. And you get like another mile closer inside. All right, there's like 12 boats, 13 boats. You get a little closer and it's like there's 20. And by the time you're a mile off the structure, I mean, it's just, I'm not kidding, 100, 110 boats out there.
Wow. Yeah.
Um, and
Yeah.
but there were so many fish that the way that I would do it is I'd be like, all right, well, I'm going to go get a mile out of the fleet and go lines in, and
Yeah.
it would work.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was crazy. It's crazy.
Well, it's
Crazy.
cool that that's innovative over the past. Essentially, it's only been around for 20 years, basically,
Yeah, it's new.
of that type of fishing with the light tackle fishing. I was actually uh did it. 2007 was my first time doing it, and it was like '07 or like 2012 when I really got busy with guiding here. It's like um I would trailer the boat up at a 21-foot center console. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous running out there and just getting the boat. I think I broke the hull of the boat out there trying to get in on that.
Ripped a
Uh,
stringer out.
yeah, but I remember catching. We slow trolled Rapala X wraps, so we caught
Yep.
fish doing that.
Yep.
The 12-inch sluggo, the jigging with the Ronzies. Um, there was the Point Jude deep force jig. I think it was a
Yep.
metal jig back then. Um, and I caught one on a tattoo sea pup.
Yep.
Talking about the wooden, the wooden spooks. And the first time in '07, we had it was 20 pound mono,
No kidding.
20 pound mono, but they were
Wow.
smaller fish. They were like 40. They were 40 to 50 pound fish,
Yep.
and they took about 40 minutes, 45 minutes to get to the boat.
Yep.
And then I
Yep.
think we switched to braid. I think other people were using braid. I think that was people. I think I made the switch to braid in like 2008, and then we had better results with braid, and we got bigger fish and this and
Yep.
that.
So
But
I remember
yeah,
the story of the sluggo. So the guys at First Light were the ones that popularized the sluggo,
yeah,
the trolling the sluggo. So I remember that story. There was a guy that was a very, very well, he owned a series of commercial fishing vessels, but he
yeah,
was a very avid recreational fisherman out of the town next to me, Manchester.
hmm
And he called one of the guys that worked at First Light after fishing for a few days, and he goes, you won't believe what I'm catching these fish on. And because the guy had been catching a ton of fish.
yeah,
And we were all fishing pretty close to each other. And he's like, really? Like, what are you doing? Goes, I'm trolling a sluggo. And everyone's shut the fuck up. You're trolling a
yeah,
sluggo? Because everything we know about a sluggo is it's a twitch bait, right? You
yeah,
twitch it. And so they went out the next day and they just absolutely hammered him on him. And they kept it to himself for a little while. And then I got a phone call from one of the guys at First Light the day before I was going to go fishing, the evening before. And he said, "Hey man, let's keep this to yourself for another week or so. I own a tackle shop too, so this is going to have to get the word out eventually, but
yeah, yeah,
um throw a white sluggo out behind the boat, send it.
yeah,
Get it way the
yeah,
hell back there and just troll it at like 2.832." I'm like,
yeah.
what? And I was with my buddy who's now a guide, and he and I were, kind of in that stage of like kids that were becoming guides kind of thing.
Right.
And I looked over at him after I got, I was like, all right, I'll try to get off the phone with him. He's like, what do you say? He said to troll a white sluggo way the hell
Huh,
behind the boat.
huh,
And he goes, dude, he's messing with you, man.
yeah,
Like, well, it can't hurt to try it, right? So let's
yeah.
let's try it. That thing was in the water, Mike, for 2 minutes, if that.
Wow.
And then I look back because like we see a couple fish slash and mark one. I was like, this is looking good. And I look back and sure just see one slash on it and eat it. And I was just no kidding. Huh. Isn't that
Wow.
interesting? Yeah. So that was, and then obviously the word got out and it really blew up. But
And
that was,
guys were making like spreader bars and daisy chains out of sluggos too, right?
they were,
Yeah,
but I never fished those. It was
yeah.
always a single 9-inch white sluggo on a owner long shank ballyhoo hook. That was the rig. Crazy,
That's
man.
funny. Yeah, interesting.
And it was I would troll, like I could only afford two tuna setups, two spinning
Yeah,
rods. Couldn't
yeah, yeah,
afford a 50. I was like
yeah,
21 years old.
yeah,
And
yeah,
so I'd go out and I'd troll an X wrap on one spinning
yeah,
rod and a sluggo on the other spinning
yeah.
rod.
We did the same thing. Yeah,
And it's like they'd eat one or the other, most
yeah.
days. They'd want one or the other most days.
That's funny.
Yeah. It was
Yeah.
cool.
It's funny how things evolve too.
Yeah. There's been so much progression. And that was really the catalyst of it. In terms of so much of the, well, especially because the Japanese had all the great, they had the great resin technology with their lighter
hmm
weight blanks and everything else. But there was a huge driving factor in really pushing the limits of spinning gear with the lines. And we were the fishery at the time because the Southern California bluefin fishery hadn't quite recovered yet. So it was GTs and us that were
Right.
the
Yeah,
only
New Zealand. Yeah, yeah. The GTS, the guys in New Zealand or wherever they were,
with the
Australia
yellowtail.
doing that. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it was pretty much that. It was the 3 fisheries that were
Wow.
the ones that had a fish that was big and pulled hard that guys were catching on spin reels. I mean, I believe Shimano was sending some engineers over to fish with some guys, and yeah, it was a really cool thing, man. And so much innovation has been downstream from that. Like the Paladin gear enhancement came out of that.
hmm
So much of the stuff came out of that.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what Shimano, all their technology, it starts at Stella and then it all gets worked down the line. That's why you see like all these other, all their whole line of reels are so good because the Saragossa gets that technology that started with Stella. and then you see it trickle down throughout the whole spinning reel lineup.
And you being one of their guys, that must be great for you to get the insight and how that works and all the technology coming out of that, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they're so good because the R&D that they put into it, and because they're a big enough company where they have the resources to do that. And you see, every 3 4 years they redo. They just did the sustain last year. Awesome, love it. Great little reel. The Stratic gets redone. The Gosa they just redid that. I think this is like the second year with the new Gosa. And it just gets better and better every time.
Yep. Yep. It's great having such a development and progression oriented business that is so committed to a perpetual evolution of their stuff that every time they come out with a new generation, there's a significant amount of information that's been applied into it. It's so impressive to watch those people operate.
Yeah, definitely for sure.
It's cool, man. Oh, brother, do you have anything you'd like to plug?
Um, Not really. I mean, if you want to get in touch with me, it's my website's realcastcharters.com. Real spelt with two e's. My Instagram, same thing. Realcast Charters. I usually post on there. Try to do. I'll do like these little fishing reports. I'll try to do some tips here and there. I do some. I have a YouTube channel as well. Um, and it's not the highest quality of production, but I try to do. Last year, I rigged the new Conch 27, so I have that whole series on there.
Yeah, that's great.
Um,
I've watched that. That's great.
Thanks. Yeah, that was just kind of just took a GoPro and just wanted to. I thought it was unique because I bought the bare hull and it's such an awesome. I mean, that's a boat that was really designed by fishing guides for fishing guides. So I love that hull and just kind of wanted to show the process. And again, it's nothing fancy. It's just me with a GoPro in my hand, just kind of talking and showing you what I'm doing. But I'm pretty happy with the result and how it all worked out.
Yeah, it's absolutely worth checking out. And for everyone listening to this, guys, Mike will be doing an instructional with us, hopefully more than one. If you want to learn more from someone who has demonstrated a very clear understanding of things, has a tremendous amount of knowledge, and you want to improve your skill set, it's certainly something worth checking out. And again, you can find all of that at fishmindx.com. In addition to all of our social is at fishmindx, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and I will hire a Gen Z person to get me a TikTok account eventually. I just won't do that myself.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I'm not on TikTok. No.
No, I'm good. I'm good. I have
Yeah,
enough. I have enough
I'm
mental
all
problems
set.
because of social media as is. I don't need to
Right.
exaggerate it.
Yeah.
Um, but
Yeah.
Mike, thank you so much, brother. It's been a pleasure. It's always great speaking with you, and yeah, thanks for coming on, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's always good time, speaking to you, and you do a great job with all your narrations and great questions, and just put a lot of great thought into it. So always enjoy doing something with you. So
Yeah, brother.
thanks.
Well, thank you, man. I appreciate it.
All right.